Hey, what's up, guys? Dr. Nick Jensen here, back with you again for another episode of Health Ignited. And I'm here again as a solo-sode without my amazing wife who's busy writing her book. She's in the middle of chapter 3 or 4 right now, and she's got a deadline of February. So she's actively working on that while I'm taking care of the podcast for the time being. So if you're new to this channel, thank you so much for showing up. The reason we're here is to help educate you on your hormonal health journey and what that means for your vitality, for your brain health, from biohacking to relationships, and how you can show up better in the world. And what we find is when we really dive deep into our hormonal health, it really gives us access or a lens through which to look at our overall health so we can make better decisions for ourselves and feel like a champ on a more regular basis. So if this is content you're enjoying, please click subscribe and stay tuned for all the upcoming updates for latest podcasts that have to do with you specifically. So you might as well show up and spend time with us. So in this conversation that we've been having for the last few weeks and going to continue on to the rest of the month, is just diving deep into DHEA. And what is DHEA? Well, we dove into that in great detail on the last podcast. So if you haven't checked that out, go and do so, because it's important to understand what this molecule is all about. But if you want to know the long name, it's a big one. It's a mouthful. It's dehydroepiandrosterone. And it's a precursor to testosterone and estrogen and a lot of our other downstream hormones that have profound effects on our body. And as I said last time, we broke down the 5 M's, which is mind, mood, memory, metabolism, and your immune system. And we kind of talked a little bit about how that shows up. But in this particular podcast, we're going to dive into some key words that really are triggering for people, probably for the better. But we want to know how these hormones, DHEA specifically, plays a role in fasting. And then we're going to dive into muscle building and anabolic health. And then basically how we work with this in practice and what that means from a holistic point of view. So let's dive into DHEA and fasting into a little bit more detail because it's such a common practice now. You know, I'll just give you a little story. When I first started talking about fasting in my practice, it actually first started happening after me experiencing fasting or fasting lifestyle for about 4 or 5 years. And I really didn't tell any patients about it. This was probably about 12 years ago. And I was worried that patients were going to think that I was crazy. Just this daily practice of intermittent fasting and seasonal extended fasts. And so I was a little nervous about, recommending that for people or advising people on it. But eventually I dove deeper into the science and application, and I found some amazing mentors to help me put this into practice in a practical doctor-patient practice setting, as opposed to just, hey, I'm going to try this out for a bit, and I think you should do it too. So I wanted to come from a science background. And so once I got the training and applied some of the theory and protocols, I was able to develop my own practice more deeply. So that's a little bit of my journey. So I've been doing fasting for a very long time now, and we take groups through these extended fasts, and we call it the metabolic upgrade. And we've got a program actually online that people can do it, a DIY version. And then we also meet virtually a few times a year to walk people through in a group setting. So if you do want to know more information about how to do this more practically, safely with the science, check out our webpage, drsjensen.com. You can find the program called the Metabolic Upgrade there for the DIY version. Because I think it's an important tool that we all could implement into our daily life to the degree that will benefit us. And that's one of the one of the pieces I want to talk to you guys about today, because I think it's easy to just say everybody should fast. And at some point in my journey, I definitely thought that. But now that I've had more time, helping patients through this journey, my own practice, I can recognize where we can become almost too attached to it and almost too obsessed about it. So I want to talk about that in relation to DHEA. So let's just talk about it as a stress first. Fasting is a stress on the body. You're going for a period of time without food, and that's going to have, to you individually, we don't know all the consequences of that. But there's something called too much stress, and then there's eustress, which is normal stress. And then I would say there's in cases when there's not enough stress, or more appropriately said, maybe not the right type of stress, right? So too much stress is pretty obvious. That's someone who's on the go constantly. There's no downtime. They're constantly in their head. They haven't maybe developed a practice that allows you to get in touch with your consciousness, or that subconscious aspect of yourself, the hidden programs. So there's that person who's just so on the go, feeling overwhelmed, not getting stuff done, probably not sleeping well at night, going to bed too late, waking up late, using stimulants to get going in the morning, wine to wind down, or whatever that alcohol of choice might be to just turn off, the system upstairs. And many of us have maybe found ourselves there. Maybe many of us can relate to that version. And maybe they're pushing it hard in the gym constantly, doing the one type of exercise over and over and over again, maybe getting stuck with the physical results or the health results, and then have a huge plate, right? Maybe you got kids, and maybe you got a very timing expensive job, and and maybe your weekends are taken up with extra activities as a parent, or for work, or you're a weekend warrior, and just constantly the gas pedal is constantly down. Some version of that would definitely be too much stress. And then there's eustress. This is like conscious applied stress on the body that can elicit a proper hormonal response instead of an extended or chronic cortisol or high cortisol response, which we know that version of you, if you've got the gas pedal down all the time, you're pushing too heavy with a heavy foot on that cortisol, which is also going to deplete your DHEA. So let's talk about that eustress. This is a consciously applied intermittent fasting schedule where you're, listening to your body, you're putting the right food in when it's time to eat, you're closing the kitchen at the appropriate time. In our practice, when we see that people are doing this consciously with a good type of stress, they typically respond well, and their adrenal system can handle that load. But I think for a lot of people, when they just throw fasting into a really crazy lifestyle reality without any sort of downtime or internal, introspection, where they're working on their breath work or meditation practice or something to actually, hit the off switch or the turn down switch without the use of alcohol, these type of people can get quite stuck, right? And I think fasting in these types of individuals can actually lead to more problems than a good form of stress. And then the not enough stress, maybe that's the sedentary individual, the person who's just sitting on the couch, there's really not a lot of physical activity maybe in the work. There's not a lot of physical activity outside of work. There's just very sedentary. And this is also typically the type of behavior that's conducive to insulin resistance. So there might be higher food intake or the overfed state situation where there's not enough applied stress. And it turns out that those people could do really well with some conscious stress added to them in the form of fasting. So I just wanted to sort of lay that out there as sort of initial framework that there can be too much stress on the body, there can be not enough stress, and then there can be sort of the Goldilocks effect, which is just the right amount at the right time applied with the right force, right? We have to know ourselves individually. So different types of fasts mean different things. So I don't really think of intermittent fasting necessarily, or that daily compressed meal window, as true fasting. Listening to Dr. Jason Fung or some of the different experts, Walter Longo, or some of these different, fasting experts that have shared some of the research on fasting. Fasting is an engaging hormonal process that takes a few days to unfold, which can be done with, like the partial fast, like Dr. Walter Longo speaks to, or the water fast that Dr. Jason Fung might speak to. And this is where you're putting a more tenuous or longer stretch of time applied to the body for a more relevant, specific outcome to initiate a true fasted state, which would be a huge fluctuation in hormones. And initially, this fasting in the first 24 to 48 hours, you might get increased glucose spikes, increased cortisol. You're going to mobilize more glucose into the body to help you just sort of overcome this lack of food, which all these hormones are playing a role in. And then eventually, as you extend that, you start getting rises in epinephrine and adrenaline and things like that. And then growth hormone eventually kicks in. And so this podcast isn't necessarily going to dive into all the different stages of fasting, but it's important to lay out that what happens in a day is very different than what happens in 5 days. Just like if you're to just do intermittent fasting and never do an extended fast, that's going to be a different stress load on the body. And so that's going to show up differently as a different type of stress for your adrenal system. So, and for most people, as long as the gas pedal is not constantly down, doing a form of intermittent fasting on a very regular basis seems to work just fine. And I'm speaking more from our clinical expertise as opposed to all the different studies on it. But here's the interesting thing on DHEA and fasting is that it's just not clear. I mean, there's a lot of variables. People all are operate a little bit differently. We have different BMIs, different life circumstances, different levels of activity, different levels of toxicity, different levels of emotional toxicity. There's a lot of different things going on for different people. But there was one study on the zebra finches, which don't necessarily correlate to the human physiology, but they were looking at aggression levels in these zebra finches when they were going for a relatively short period of time, but to them fasting. And what actually happened in that period of time without food is their aggression levels came up. And so they correlated that back to DHEA, which may translate to humans, but again, looking at zebra finches to address our physiology obviously isn't the best of sources. So, but there's not a lot of conclusive data to what happens to DHEA, whether it goes up or down in human populations. In PCOS cases, so women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, it turns out that doing some version of intermittent fasting can have a decreasing effect on DHEA. And I would say the most likely scenario for impact on PCOS is probably more to do with insulin regulation, because as you take time away from food, you will eventually improve insulin sensitivity, but you also bring insulin levels down. And so in these people with PCOS, they tend to be more prone to weight gain. And so they're more potentially insulin resistant. And so I think that there's these indirect effects of these excess androgens starting to decline because you're improving the sensitivity of insulin. And I think that's like one of the most important things I think that we can learn about DHEA in regards to fasting is that depending on our stress load, we might have different responses. But more importantly, what are all the permutations of having better insulin sensitivity? And I think that's the most important way to look at this is if we're having an impact on insulin or lowering insulin resistance, improving the sensitivity of our cells to the hormone insulin, then we're probably going to have a better adrenal reserve. Our adrenal system's not going to be getting its butt kicked every 10 minutes because the blood sugar is all over the place. We're going to have a more sustained, steady response for these levels. And so I think, really addressing adrenal health and addressing, the time that we're spending in a fasted state and addressing us as an individual will give us different data. But from what I've seen is it's not super clear whether or not someone's going to increase their DHEA in response to fasting, whether short-term or long-term. And from every study I've looked at, they keep saying that not enough data is there to tell us definitively what actually happens to DHEA when fasting. But like I said, I think it just goes back to the individual. And if we're constantly that gas pedal down, too much stress individual, you may not have a beneficial effect of DHEA on fasting. And I say all this because at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see clinically, because often when people are doing the right things, plural, they tend to have a better response in how the DHEA is behaving. So you have to stay tuned for the rest of those details. And then I want to share a little bit about a population of people that maybe are afraid of fasting. And I'll talk specifically about a friend of mine, a trainer who I got to do an extended fast. I recommended a 5-day fast just to try it out. He was healthy, very lean, very, very bulked, but lean individual. Obviously took really good care of himself in the gym, physically very strong. And there was tremendous amount of fear there about considering doing an extended fast. And I said, listen, it's just, 5 days of your life, whatever you were doing before, you can get back into. And my challenge to you is that, because you've got such good muscle build and you're worried about losing muscle in this fast, why don't you just keep exercising every day? You might not be able to do the full intensity workout that you're used to, but I encourage you to stay active and keep lifting weights during your experience. You might just find that your endurance isn't quite as, strong. Your energy may be a little bit waning, especially in the first couple of days. But let's just make that one criteria that you keep active during your fast. And so we measured his body composition before entering the fast and literally every day of the fast. And what we saw, maybe to your surprise or maybe not, is that his fat mass went down, which makes sense. He got into ketosis. He started burning up some of that fat, but his muscle mass actually increased. He obviously looked more chiseled than he did when he started, but his muscle mass was increasing because the stimulus for muscle growth was still there, despite not having the protein, which is very scary for people who are trying to maintain size and not lose weight and whatnot. And it was a tremendous insight for this individual who actually ended up pausing or stopping the fast of 4 days, not because he couldn't make it to the fifth day, but because he had a big dinner event coming the next night. And he wanted to try to break the fast according to how we typically recommend and not move into this big meal and, hurt his GI tract with an onslaught of food. So we did end the fast a little bit earlier, but it was very insightful for him to see that he actually maintained and actually built muscle mass, lost fat mass, and actually did a pretty good job of maintaining his energy and wasn't too struggled. Now, we have a specific way in which we support people during fasting with certain supplements and things like that to help to prevent catabolism or breakdown. And like I said, you can check out those details in more detail if you'd like on the DIY version of the metabolic upgrade, or join us on one of our upcoming group sessions. So because it's an important tool, right? It doesn't fix everything, but I tell you what, if it's not in the tool belt, it probably, you could definitely do some research to find out whether or not it's going to work for you. But I think, my hope here in this initial discussion around fasting and DHEA is really where I'm at on this whole adrenal health spectrum, and look back to maybe some of the previous podcasts to really help to outline the adrenal health component if you're not totally clear, because I think really understanding that can give you more insight in how maybe you did on a fast in the past and why that maybe hurt you or hindered you or troubled you, or maybe why you did really well because you had the right amount of stress with the right force at the right time. So those kind of things are really important, I think, when addressing DHEA levels in fasting. So basically, we don't know enough, right? When have you heard that before? But I think it's important, right? I think it's important to say that this definitively does this or not. I think we can't say that unless there's a tremendous amount of confidence. And like I said, I'm going to give you my clinical experience at the end, so you can make use of that information any way you see fit. But I think and some of this information we just don't yet know, right? Because here's just one last thing I guess I should say on this is that there's a ton of information or articles written on like testosterone is boosted when fasting, and one would think that if testosterone is getting boosted, DHEA probably is too, DHEA being the precursor to testosterone. And so, and that's not the scope of this discussion, like I said, but, I tell this to patients too. And I would say that very well could have been the case for this trainer who was still stimulating testosterone through exercise, was still stimulating muscle growth, yet not necessarily having access to the daily protein intake. But as we know from autophagy, breaking down cellular material, he's probably recycling a lot of the proteins that were getting broken down because they were in damaged tissue that was no longer serving him. And then he got to repackage those proteins and put them into areas that are needing that stimulus or needing that repair, right? So there is a ton of information out there, or we're being told that there's all sorts of reasons to fast to build testosterone. And again, even with that information, I'd say it's so individual. You can't say that everybody's going to get whatever it is, it says 180% to 1500% improvement in testosterone with fasting. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, right? Like we're all individuals. So I'll put that one to rest for a bit. Now let's talk about muscle mass, because that's important too, right? Whether we're just talking about, the dad bod and trying to maintain your physique as you age so that you age more gracefully. You can still play soccer, football, hockey, whatever with your boys or your girls, with your kids. You want to stay strong for as long as you can, right? And I'm not talking about like the dad bod that maybe got all the attention with like the big beer belly and that kind of dad bod. I'm talking about being a strong example of what your kids can grow into. And I think I know I want that for myself. I want that for my kids now and for when they get older, but I want to be an example of what it means to stay healthy for as long as possible. So I want to reframe the dad bod and how do we optimize our hormones to meet the demands of the physical body so that we don't buy into this idea that, oh, we're getting older, so we can just, fit into that big bellied, flabby arms, loose gut, saggy pants kind of version of ourselves. We can actually, and this has nothing to do, or maybe a little bit to do with vanity, but really more a call to action of like, how do you see yourself internally? How do you see yourself externally? How do you want to show up for your kids, your wife, your family, your community? Do you really want to be a shining example of what's possible, or are we just going to, go with the status quo and just become complacent with our health? And I think that, addressing this from that through a lens of DHEA and muscle building is important. So what do we know about this? One could supplement it in if you're in the US. Here in Canada, it has to be prescribed to you. It would make sense to look at or get an assessment of what your DHEA level is at. So that, blood, urine, or saliva. Basically, for us, we always check blood when we're doing an initial assessment on someone. We want to know someone's lifestyle markers, which would be inflammatory markers, to lipid panel, cardiovascular health, all that stuff, insulin levels. But we also want to know your hormones. We definitely want to know your testosterone, insulin, DHEA, estrogen. If you're a man, also we want to know your prostate health and those kind of things. So we want data in order to decide, what kind of action to take. But what we do know is that when you are stimulating your muscle, you are getting an increase in the hormonal response, right? It's just like this eustress, the good stress. When we apply a force to the body, we'll have a hormonal outcome. And initially, in one study that I was looking at, showed that both men and women benefited from a surge in DHA post-exercise, weight training specifically, but women had a much more profound increase than men did, which I think is very interesting. But here's the reality: is that stimulus, once it's gone, you go back to a normal baseline after that pressure has subsided. And so you'll get a spike and then a fall. And so really, like, what does that mean for body composition? What does it mean for strength? Because it's one thing to have a hormone surge, but then can your cells receive that hormone? And this is one of the things that we talk about so often. This is why we talk about detoxification at the cellular level and clearing cell inflammation, because those hormones have to communicate to the inside of the cell. They have to cross that plasma cell membrane through a receptor to actually activate in the mitochondria. And so just because you get a surge in a hormone or take an exogenous hormone, can you get that hormone to communicate the cell? And that's where the rubber meets the road when it comes to hormone optimization. So same thing here. You could have unhealthy cells, get a surge of DHEA post-exercise, but can your body use that hormone? Is it actually being received by the mitochondria through the cell membrane? So these are all things that sort of differentiate the effects of doing exercise from one person to the next, right? So here, here's another study that looked at an older population that actually added DHEA, and they added 50 milligrams, which is a medial or middle of the road sort of dose. Higher end of the dose range for women, but middle of the road definitely for men. And so in supplementing it in, they actually saw increases in testosterone, which would make sense. Increases in IGF-1, which is correlated with growth hormone, and also something called MGF, which is mechano growth factor. And so in this particular study, they were tracking men and women over a 6-month or a full year to see what that particular dose would have as an effect on strength, size, and I think endurance was the other one. And so all that the study really showed is that those who were supplementing in DHEA, they saw these increases in the testosterone, IGF-1, and also the MGF, the mechano growth factor, which helps to actually increase the size of the muscle. But they saw that where it really played a role was on that 1 rep max. And so not necessarily like how much you can do over like many reps, but really that 1 rep max. So they're able to push more weight as a result of the DHEA supplementation, and probably as a result of these stimulus. And so it's important to think about this. What does DHEA do when it gets in your body? It's a precursor hormone. It's going to distribute into hopefully the androgens, if that's the goal, but also stimulate or get converted into the estrogens, which can be very beneficial for women. Typically post-menopause, but also potentially pre-menopause and perimenopause. But it is important to think about this DHEA is eventually going to convert into something. So if you add it in and then implement an exercise program, you are likely to get these increased conversions into testosterone and some of the other hormones that we want to create an impact on. So I think that was interesting to see, pairing an activity, specifically strength training, together with DHEA to see what kind of outcome was available. And then in general, so if you're not supplementing it, and like, having this as one of the cogs in the wheel of your health wheel, so to speak. And if you were to put exercise, and we'll talk about in a minute what kind of exercise, but if you're to put that into your program, you're likely to get these known stimulus of DHEA post stress or post workout. And then over time, does that sort of exemplify an ongoing sort of surge or increase or up leveling of your DHEA in your blood or urine or saliva over the long term? And then there's a question of, like, again, when is it too much? When are you putting too much pressure on the body? When are you putting maybe too much exogenous hormone in, and are you converting too much of that into estrogen, right? We have to be mindful of dose and application and force and timing with everything we do, right? So but this is why we also encourage exercise variation. So a lot of the research on DHEA correlates back to muscle strength through weightlifting. But if we look at, and that's great, I think, looking through the lens of the androgenic or anabolic system. So having a stress stimulus, having this a release of the hormone, having this stimulus for muscle growth through testosterone, MGF, and IGF-1, I think that's great. But then we also want to think about DHEA in this world of the adrenal system. So if we're really pushing ourselves to excess with spending way too long in the gym, as an example, or spending every workout on an exercise bike and just pushing it to like maximal effort on a daily basis. So maybe like zone 3 or 4, depending on which scale you might use for exercise tolerance. If we keep pushing ourselves to such a high degree on a daily basis, does that work for us? Or what we typically see in practice is, if when people have the gas pedal down for exercise and they keep doing the same thing over and over again at really high intensity, you really start to burn yourself out. And so the long-term effect of that might be a lowering of DHEA, right? A heightening cortisol, but eventually, as we discussed in the last podcast, you can get a real flattening to cortisol and DHEA together. So your adrenal health can really decline as a result of too much exercise, too much force applied too often, and that can create issues for people. Okay, so last part of this discussion, I just want to dive into this holistic picture. Let's look at DHEA in the scope of clinical application, or a patient applying a program into their life and what that means for their health. So first of all, we would never just do one thing. Like, this is sort of the reality of studies. The studies are amazing because they can help to really break things down and give us some really interesting data on one or two specific things and how those things are applied to, say, in this case, one's health, and what are the outcomes. Was there mild benefit? Was there moderate? Was there maximal benefit? And you can look for a topic and find 5 different studies sort of sharing slightly different results, and it can be totally overwhelming. And so I think this is like that. There's a beauty in that, in the sense that maybe the data is not conclusive, or maybe you can cherry pick and go, well, I found some really good stuff here, so I'm just gonna focus on the good, or the opposite of that. Obviously that can happen too. But this is the beauty of a clinical practice, because you're not just doing the one thing, right? So we're going to address someone's diet, we're going to address someone's stress factors, someone's lifestyle, someone's mindset, how they're moving, how they're eating, how they're sleeping, and there's many levers to pull in someone's health to help to discover that it's never just one thing. And so the studies can elucidate some certain things for us, but usually in practice, we're pulling a bunch of different levers that together there's going to be synergy. And so I think that there's huge value in taking that information. But this is something we tell all our patients, is that as much benefit as we do get out of studies, we get maybe just as much benefit of hearing patient stories, of hearing what people did, and sort of laying out all the criteria that would have allowed for a response to be positive or negative. And then we get to take all that information on a daily basis of the thousands of people that we get to work with, and apply that information to each new individual that we see. And it becomes this like library of information of clinical relevance that I think is important for that individual, because we can see how things or correlate with certain individuals and how that might resemble, patients from our past that might show up with similar circumstances. So, we're constantly as doctors filtering all this information through that history, as we all do. I'm just talking about how this is applied into a clinical practice. And so when we're looking at things like DHEA, we want to look at all these different axes of influence that are going to contribute to someone's health and hopefully help to build up this adrenal resilience in the body. And on this discussion, if it's not clear from our previous talks, is that it's often more about what you take out, right, than it is what you put in. And so asking, I go back to the Hippocratic, not the Hippocratic Oath. Well, I'd go back there too. First, do no harm, amongst other things. But one of my favorite Hippocrates quotes is, before you heal someone, ask if he's willing to give up the things that made him sick. And that was very gender specific back in the day. But, before you heal someone, ask if they are willing to give up the things that make them sick. And, that's a reality, because if we're going to get so focused on adding things in and becoming very additive in our approach, we can sometimes get lost of like, oh, I stacked all these things together. Why didn't I get the outcome that I needed? Well, it's because you're not going to bed on time, man, or because you're drinking alcohol every night, or, there's lingering toxins. You haven't addressed your heavy metals in your mouth, get an infection in your gut. So why would you think that you're going to get, an extra benefit of adding these things in? So we want to be subtractive as well as additive in our approach. And this is why what we talk about pulling different levers, right? We want to address your gut health and your brain health and your sleep rhythm and your relationships and your hormones. We want to try to dance with you in as much of these different areas as possible, and the individual sitting in front of us is going to be the gauge with, as to what they're able to take on, right? We want to always be able to meet someone where they are, not just give them a big shove and say, you need to be over there. And if you're not, I can't work with you. No, like we all work through things at our own pace, right? So what are the simplest levers to pull? What are as many supportive tools that we can add in to support the process? And I say to people all the time, it's like, if you're gonna add something new into your lifestyle, like, what are you willing to get rid of? Like, what are you willing to sacrifice? If you're gonna add something in, you have to take something out. And so I use the analogy of like furniture. I know we're guilty of this. We used to live in a small townhouse, and not that our house is much bigger now, but we had to move out of the city because rates for larger homes in Vancouver is ridiculous for a young family. So we moved to the beautiful burbs and are happy where we are. But at the time when we were living in Vancouver, we kept having to get new storage units to put more of our stuff in, because we went from one kid to two kids. And so we had like more furniture scattered around our place. So it looked ridiculous. That it was really hard to live in that minimalist type of life when, kids come into your life. And so the message really was, you got to get rid of stuff before you can put new furniture in your house, but we're all guilty of this. We're like, oh, I need something to store this extra crap I have. Right. So let's get another cabinet. Let's get another, dresser. We keep adding things into our homes, and then our homes feel cluttered. We feel overwhelmed, right? It's affecting us on a daily basis. And we're doing that with our health. The next probiotic, this probiotic's gonna be amazing. This fish oil is gonna be incredible, or this new supplement for my brain is gonna be amazing. We keep thinking about what we can add in, or that new gym just opened up. I need to get another membership because the one at the CrossFit's not doing enough for me. Whatever the issue is, we're so additive in our approach, which at least we're doing something. But while we're on this journey, can we subtract some stuff? And so looking through the lens of DHEA, being that it's an adrenal hormone, it's responding to the stress. So if we can pull stresses out, then we can build our reserve, right? And without just adding things in that stimulate it and adding things in that replace it, right? And so getting subtractive as well as additive in our approach, I think is important. So I could go on and on, as you can see, and I'm grateful for you guys tuning in right to the end. I think this is an important conversation that obviously we're talking about DHEA, but it's going to cross over to many different things in your life. But looking through the lens of the adrenal system is so important, because the adrenals are constantly working for us, and they're either working for us because we're pushing the right buttons at the right time with the right force, or they're overworking. And we're really starting to see the effects of a dysregulated hormonal system and a massively depleted, androgenic system or anabolic system. And what's the effect of that over a long period of time, right? And so, with that being said, if you're enjoying this conversation and conversations like this, we would love to invite you into our Health Ignited Club. This is where we take these concepts and we bring them into our tribe, and we have conversations in a more intimate kind of way. We record a teaching for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we turn off the record button and just engage with the community. And we go over Q&As, and we go over like concerns that people might be having about what's going on in their lives. And it's a real intimate discussion and community board that's live. And we meet each month, and it's called Dr. Jensen Health Club. And so we'd love to have you in that club with us. We'd love to be able to engage with you guys more intimately. So if that's something that floats your boat and gets you excited, which we hope it does, make sure you check out the offerings below. And if you haven't already, continue to subscribe to the content. And as you can see, we're changing things up a little bit here. Sonia will be here sometimes she won't. But like I said, she's deep into her writing, and I want to honor her in that process. So you're stuck with me for a bit. Please share if you're enjoying content in this kind of way. Do you like this delivery? Do you like the more engagement with my wife and myself together? Let us know what you think. We're here to listen and adapt, just like the adrenal glands. So we'll see you next time.